I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. What I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Hey, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like right here on Black Power Media. I'm Jared Ball, joined, of course, by my main man, Geechee Y'all. We expect Brother Diallo, who is just now coming in the building, fashionably late, making his stylish entrance. What's up, fellas? Good morning to you. How you all doing?
I'm well. All right. Geechee didn't send me the link.
First of all, the link is in the group chat.
Ooh. So I can't access that from my phone.
Oh, what's that? But tell her where you really was at. Tell her where you really was at. Where you was at? You was meeting with Jay-Z on that conference call y'all had at 7.
I was trying to free Young Thug.
It's a busy world out here. It's a busy world. Shout out to all the remixers in the building. Appreciate you joining us, and to all those who will hear this later on all your favorite podcast outlets. We appreciate you as well. Good morning and greetings. Definitely hit all the buttons and put this live in your socials and invite others to join you for some of this good boom bap breakfast. We have a lot to get into this morning, and later on we'll be joined by Dr. Brian Lozenski to talk about his new book, My Emancipation Don't Fit Your Equation. As much of it as least as we can get to. But yeah, so I don't know if you all had anything you wanted to jump into before any of this, but it was just brought to my attention, and I figured, kind of piggybacking off where we were last week, that we might want to start in with any of this. But before we do, let me just ask you both, just in general, again, how you all are doing, what's been up on your platforms, what's coming up on your platforms, or anything else.
So for me, what's coming up on our platform, we have episode 3 of Where Are They Now? It's going to be on Tuesday, featuring Yusuf Bunchy Shakur, and we're going to be covering Active Transportation Company out of Louisville. Ironically, the parents of Allen Houston, the NBA star, his parents had a company that pretty much tanked, but they were saved. So we're going to kind of talk about that. And then Sunday, I'll be in Charlotte talking to some Black nonprofit leaders from different groups, kind of helping them realize that their solutions are ameliorative at best. So that might be a tough, interesting conversation, but that's about it for me.
What about you, Brother Diallo?
Well, Monday on my Monday morning local indie radio broadcast here in Chicago, Q4 Radio, I'm going to be talking about free to be oppressed, women and religion, and how, because, just dealing with, women are fighting to wear the hijab, and women are fighting to maintain their reproductive rights and theocratic rule, and why, even though most Abrahamic religion are misogynistic to the core, why women tend to still embrace these religions and hold to them even more aggressively than most men in most societies, the West and the East. So I'm gonna talk about that, and finish my discussion about leftism and liberalism and conservatism, and why Black people get so confused about that, why we tend to jump around in these various political ideologies, and I think fail to really understand what they mean and how they impact us.
So just light work, in other words, is what you're saying.
Yeah,
You're just getting into
the
some
ramblings
light,
of a
easy.
madman. Just the ramblings of a madman.
Definitely look forward to that. And that just reminded me of a comment that we got from last week's show that I meant to ask you all about. Because I admit a bit of sensitivity to the critique. We got a lot of positive responses, actually. So I know the tendency is to focus on the criticism and not the positive. So I do want to shout out, and recognize that it's not all criticism. But I don't think I'm finding it right now. But the short of it is that during our conversation about Angela Davis, Tamika Mallory, and Cardi B last week, I wanted to read. I should have had it ready. My bad. But the comment was essentially saying that we were accused of misogynoir, that three men talking about Black women in a critical way is inappropriate. And I have, so, and then I hear you saying, Brother Diallo, that you're going to be talking about women in religion. So I want to, what do you all think? What would your response be to that? And I'm sure you've gotten similar criticism before that here we are as three cis het men talking about in a critical way these three Black women, because it's about to we're about to come back to that in a few minutes.
I've been seeing that around the community where it's like I've had women say, men shouldn't have any opinion about women, and men have no right because as a result of sexism and patriarchy, that men shouldn't even just have any opinion about women. I don't generally speak to that unless they deal with the specifics of the critique, unless they say these particular things that you said. So it's a pendular society, and people go from one extreme to the next. We go from men have absolute control and domination of women to men shouldn't even acknowledge women. And then when you don't acknowledge women, they say, why aren't women part of the discussion? So I just think that's a reactionary and baseless attack, unless they say these specific things that you said were inaccurate, or these specific things that you said were sexist or misogynistic. But if they just say the fact that you have a view on a woman or an opinion about a woman who's in the public sphere, who has a public influence, to me, it's nonsensical. But if they could extract some point that was made or something that was articulated that can be identified as sexist, I'd be willing to hear it specifically. But the fact that I'm a man that has a point of view about a woman who has a point of view, and we're just not talking about their gender, or we're not saying, oh, these women have no right to have a voice. I mean, it's absurdist.
Yeah. Go ahead, Geechee.
I mean, I probably couldn't add much more to that. I think this concept, like I think I get accused of that probably often on social media, but they will skip over anything about Claudia Jones, Dr. CBS, or any of these people. So if I'm posting about these people all the time, and then I might make a critique of a favorite celebrity, that's really the only time that you hear it. And then on top of that, if we're talking about the work and the books and the content, if I'm talking about that, and these supporters haven't even read it or don't even know the details of the work, to me, that comment goes in the trash. Because, like, for instance, the one sister that says she support everything Tamika does says she didn't read her book, and I'm like, well, that's not a great supporter. But you couldn't even begin to tell me about her politics. So if we're talking about her politics, we're not talking about her personal life, what she did or didn't do, or these things, more so of her politics. So if DeRay McKesson was still popping right now, I'm pretty sure his politics would be getting challenged too as well. But today and even last week, I guess that was last week, we also talked about Nard or Charlemagne as well, which is kind of
he's coming up again today
right,
too.
right.
Like it's
yeah. So
but
so he's the kind of the front man for that, and yeah. So yeah, that in itself is something else. And this last thing is one of his goals and one of his approaches to engage with me is always telling me how much he loved Black women and how much he put Black women in place. You know, God, Black women, and something else he said is his saving grace. And so this concept of the type of Black women you put in, right? I'm pretty sure there's Black women in the chat that I could put you up right now that's probably not gonna like anything that you say. So yeah, I think it's just like, you know, like what Diallo said, I would want one of them to kind of step up on the platform or step up and present, okay, this is what was sexist, misogynistic, blah, blah, as opposed to the points.
Here's the comment. I found the comment, and it's from Everything is Politics is the name. And it says, I'm usually a fan of a fair amount of BPM content, but this one, I mean, I've only seen a few minutes. This is the line that got me. I've only seen a few minutes of this, and it's already conjuring misogynoir. So I was like, all right, so you don't just in a few minutes, but I've said this in one of my previous comments, and I think it also applies here. BPM needs a Black womanist host show. Kim and other women are great, but they aren't necessarily academics. A Black woman gender studies theoretical perspective would be greatly valuable. Don't get me wrong, these women aren't perfect, but my question to the hosts are any of us, are any of y'all? I mean, let's take out the speck in our own eyes before we take out the speck in another's. None of your viewers know what skeletons y'all got in your wardrobes. This somewhat comes off as self-righteous, essentialist, and a tad bit bitter. An all-male panel, I mean, women can be misogynistic too, of course. Plus, how are all of these theoretical critique pushing the dial for Black struggle? It just feels sensationalist, and I'm not here for it. So my first issue was just I've only seen a few minutes of this. That quote, like, you can't, like, that's not fair. And to my point, and just personally, I don't think one show we do with all men should be seen as representative of all that is done by me or us here. We've invited many Black women academics to host a show. And I would invite Everything is Politics. If you or anyone you know is interested, we've even invited remixers to throw up, you know, share a video with us auditioning to join the show. So if you have, but if you Everything is Politics or anyone else has suggestions for hosts or shows, invite them to submit a proposal at blackpowermedia.org. We're constantly looking and inviting folks. And we invite women and have invited many women and launched shows for many women actually on this platform and in my own work separately. So so anyway, I am sensitive to that criticism, but I you know, just want to make sure we're all being taken in context here. So we're also, by the way, we weren't unearthing any of these women's skeletons. We're being critical of their public political positions and platforms. Nobody's digging in people's personal businesses. And then lastly, I think theoretical critique is important. I think so much of what we're doing is unclear ideologically and theoretically, and therefore leading us in confused directions. So anyway, by the way, that comment started its own conversation where there was pushback against that comment. And so I appreciate all of that. But I did, anyway, wanted to bring that just quickly to our attention. I also want to thank quickly Coco and Free 60 for dropping in those super thanks, which is a new feature BPM is qualified for. So once a video has gone up and it's not live anymore, you can hit a super thanks and, you know, support the show. And we appreciate that. So anyway, that was it. Anything else before we move on? And yeah, anyway, but in general, I'm all for it. I would love to get some more sisters up here and just people in general, you know, doing shows and bringing more theoretical and other perspectives. So I'm all for it. Anyway, all right, fellas. So this story I just got sent to me on Twitter, I think late last night, early this morning. So let me just go ahead and pull this up here real quick. And let's get into this because it dovetails nicely, of course, off of what we were talking about last week and already starting with this morning, and involves some of our favorite folks who are out here doing the work. And let's see. Nope, that wasn't it. Oh, my bad.
Front line. Hey, you know what? You should probably do this one because it's updated with some new catchy words of now they covering the RICO charge too. So
do which one?
The one
you sent one?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I'll start with that then. I was gonna just first of all, let me just start with what I saw, and then I'll pull that one up. The first one was just this tweet that I got. The social justice arm of Jay-Z's record label, Roc Nation, has convened a coalition of social justice leaders from various industries for a summit that is set to take place this summer amid the midterm elections in the U.S. So between this and then, of course, we're going to come back and talk about this all throughout the platform in more detail later, but there's the coming Black Power Summit as well. So we have Black Power summits, we have social justice summits, we have a lot of stuff going on that I think does need some theoretical critique and intervention. But so anyway, so this was the story. But the summit is set to take place this summer amid the midterm elections in the U.S. So we're about to get back into that, and maybe Diallo and I can get back into our sheep herding disagreement or whatever that was from last week. Oh no, this was a different story. Hold on, I'm gonna come back to that in a second. Let me get the one you wanted us to look at, Geechee. Okay, no, that's not it. This is it. Here we go. Jay-Z's Roc Nation to take on RICO, police brutality, and criminal justice reform. Roc Nation has assembled a coalition consisting of social justice leaders from various industries for a summer summit taking place amid the midterm elections in the U.S. It is one of their latest initiatives to leverage the power of hip-hop lyrics, music, and culture, currently targeted in RICO cases nationwide to address police brutality and criminal justice reform. Definitely check out the Riot Starter episode from last night where they were talking about that case in detail. And I have to go back and finish it myself. These children demanding parenting continues to interrupt my media consumption, so I have to come back and finish that. But was there something else in this particular that you wanted to look at, Geechee or Diallo?
I mean, I think it's interesting how obviously they just threw the RICO in there, because again on the other article it says nothing about the RICO, but it doesn't go into detail. But also, again, if you having freedom of lyrics, I don't know if they want to say, hey, whatever these rappers say on wax, you can't use against them in court. I don't know if that's going to be their thrust. But I mean, if this is what your rapper is promoting, so you got several rappers in Roc Nation that I would think it gives some kind of gangster rap and guns and shoot somebody or whatever. So I think that would be interesting to kind of look at the RICO charge in that aspect. I mean, again, I know it's still kind of like a social justice issue, but it seems like it's only because of the rappers, the black elite is being funneled in. That's why they kind of concerned about it. So,
yeah, it's kind of because I don't support using art as a means to convict someone, but evidence is evidence. So if you commit a crime and then you articulate that crime, whether it's in a conversation or in a painting or in a photograph, and so I saw the prosecutor that was bringing the RICO case, who was a black woman, and she said, we don't use lyrics, we use evidence, and we when we're building a case, and they've been following this since 2015. So if they're when he said one lyric in particular, they're taken from Young Thug, and see, he said, "I shot that boy in front of his mother," um, and there was a rival. A gang rival, that's what their terminology, a rival gang member. But I mean, when I was in Kansas City as a child, I was on the gang list. So whenever I see the authorities talk about gang members, I know it's pretty arbitrary. Just being poor black living in a certain area will qualify. I wasn't in a gang. So anyway, there was a gang member who was shot in front of his mother. And they're building a case, and they got material evidence, they got logistical evidence, they got confessions and snitches, and they got a lyric. I mean, is that to be used as evidence? It no longer is just a rap lyric. A kitchen knife is no longer just an instrument in your kitchen. If it's involved in a homicide or if it's connected to a crime, it goes in the little baggie. So I just can't fully get with the whole, well, you can't use lyrics. I'm like, well, you can't murder black people in your community and have a ongoing criminal enterprise that targets and exploits poor and working class black people. So I don't think they should use art in against the artist, but I don't think they should deny themselves any evidence that's available to them. Because me personally, when I'm measuring the worth and value or relevance of an artist, I look at their lyrics and say, well, this is the kind of garbage that they are pushing out to the people. So it's not necessarily a social justice to me. To me, it's a criminology thing, and lawyers have argued. They've outlawed using rap lyrics in New York because of Jay-Z. But if it becomes evidence, who are we to denounce evidence and when there's a black life, at stake?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
Well, one more thing. So, ironically, I text this in the private chat. When we focused on Jay-Z and not JC, John C. I think his last name Malone, right? John C. Malone is the biggest landowner in the U.S. He controls a lot of Atlanta because he owns the company that owns the Braves, right? And so when you start, one of the things that's always kind of frustrating to me is like you got Rock Nation owned by Live Nation, owned by Liberty Corporation, owned by John C. Malone. It's kind of like it's. I know we talked about this last week, but it's like, at what point will we look at these people politics and what they do and what kind of social issues they cause by hoarding cash resources and stuff, and then they're gonna also fund a rapper or entertainer who's doing social justice to fix those issues? Is kind of like it's stupid to me.
So there's a lot just quickly, there's a lot of overlapping things going on here, and I'm glad you mentioned John C. Malone because he's also relevant as the American billionaire who's best known for chairman of Liberty Media. Now that's interesting because I always thought he was originally British, but he was born in Connecticut. So, but he is also the initial founder of and major investor in Black entertainment television. Once upon a time, he gave. I'm trying to see if they mentioned that in here. He gave $500,000 to Bob Johnson to start BET to Johnson's $15,000 initial investment. I'll have to find that part later. But so I thought that I just think that that's interesting, that here he is back again again indirectly involving himself in Black politics. Through this, I'm just trying to look this up real quick. But through this this latest venture here. But let's see. Yeah, that's all right. Anyway, it's the same guy, but just come back to that. Just come back to that. But anyway, what else did you want to say about John Malone? Because I just wanted to highlight that point real quick.
I mean, I think just chasing the money and how he get the money. I mean, they, people, refer to him as, obviously the person who owns the most land. He has enough land to, I think they said, to cover Maine or a couple states. But again, I just think this concept of these people, like when you think about the social justice issues that you're talking about, the funders of these people are literally the cause of the same issues that you're talking about. And, I know, again, we've seen this merging of entertainment and activism and social justice and stuff. It's just kind of like, to me, it's sickening. But again, when you critique it, it's almost like you're hating or misogynistic, all these other things. But
well,
by the way, they work together again. By the way, I'm sorry to have gone into this little side. John Malone partners with Bob Johnson to help minorities increase retirement savings. So this is from 2020. They linked up again. I invested along Bob when he launched Black Entertainment Television. When Bob approached me to talk about his work with 401k auto portability, I recognized an opportunity to extend that work into practical ways to achieve inclusive capitalism. So Malone has a long history of this sort of involvement. And again, I've raised this question for years. How could BET ever have been considered Black when the initial investment was $500,000 from Malone to Bob Johnson's $15,000? It doesn't matter whose name is on the door. You already know what the deal is when you have that kind of. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead, Diallo. Yeah.
BET was honest. It was Black entertainment, not Black ownership. It was Black. It was there to entertain us. That's what it was there. And so, but I'd like to, address, because Jay-Z has been very honest, even going back as his initial, when he first started entering politics, he was actually mentored into being I don't know if we even have a term for it, like a compassionate mogul, like with Bush and his compassionate conservative, like using his influence to help us. Remember Russell Simmons and the Rockefeller drug laws way back in the early 90s and all that. So we've always had artists involved in the struggle. I'm not against artists being political. All of my favorite artists are highly political. You look at any struggle, there's always been music and art and even theater and movies attached to any movement, whether it's Black liberation and empowerment. You got Holly Gierma and making movies about, from Sankofa to movies about the Ethiopian resistance to colonization. So I'm not against artists being political Fela, Bob Marley. We've got a long history of that. So I don't want to just say, oh, he's a music guy or he's a rapper and he's trying to get into politics. I don't have a problem with that. My thing is, what is his ideology? What is his political slant? What is his agenda? And Jay-Z has been very clear that he's monetizing Black suffering. He's monetizing Black resistance. He's turning it into a brand, and he's using it to elevate his brand. And that's why they show up on cue during these election cycles. We got all this time in between election cycles where we don't hear from these prominent leading blacks. And as soon as an official election cycle comes, they come out and they start to voice Ice Cube with his contract with Black America, and now Jay-Z with his social justice thing. So Jay-Z's ideology is fundamentally damaging and fundamentally counter to the interests of the masses of Black people. They want to enrich more. They actually want to reach into the community, extract a few of us to turn into more Negro elites who are then going to turn around and act against our interests and align with the white elites. And this is going on. So what we should do is begin to show the amount of support and love to truly revolutionary and conscious artists, because art is central and necessary to any political struggle.
I absolutely. So again, I'm with you on that. I don't begrudge artists becoming activists. I'm much more interested in their politics, but I'm more interested in anyone, activist, artist, etc., who is promoted and supported to represent the struggle in certain ways and then takes us in certain directions. So that's why my interest in this was piqued. So when I looked at this story from ABC News about the St. Jay-Z's Rock Nation, so again, they're very clear. This is about the midterm. So now in the few hours before the show that I had, I was not able to find what I was really looking for. So if anybody gathered here or in the chat wants to do this, please help me out with this. But I was looking for specific, donations coming in from either Act Blue or some other Democratic Party funding source into this endeavor. I haven't found the direct tie yet, but I think we've got a couple of clear links that I'll show you in just a second. But I was curious to see, like, is the Soros money pouring in, or how much of it, and how is it being, all that kind of stuff, because this is clearly about getting support for the Democratic Party and not really raising any sort of level of political consciousness among the people. But the social justice arm. Okay, so this, and I wanted to remind myself that this is meant to be the social justice arm of Jay-Z's record label, Rock Nation. Has convened, again, this coalition of social justice leaders from various industries. The United Justice Coalition was assembled by Team Rock, which leads the label's philanthropic initiatives and is set to gather in New York City on July 23rd to raise awareness about racial justice and policy issues impacting people of color across America. Dania Diaz, Rock Nation's managing director of philanthropy, told ABC News the team hopes the summit will lead to political action and engagement amid the midterm elections. Now, of course, they can't say, please go vote for the Democrats, but that's clearly what the goal is. There's your boy, who's going to be one of the main invitees. Headliners include radio host Charlemagne the God, civil rights attorney Ben Crump, Dream Corps founder Van Jones, Until Freedom co-founder Tamika Mallory, and professor and author Michael Eric Dyson. So they had all my favorites. My man.
That's your boy.
So they got your boy, they got my boy, they got the whole crew.
Van Jones.
Definitely.
Diallo boy, that's Van Jones.
Definitely, this is going to be the winning team. There's Roger Goodell smiled up with Jay-Z as Jay-Z took over and destroyed any potential good that might have come from Kaepernick's efforts.
But Jared, real quick. So yeah. I think one of the key things what Diaz says is an opportunity for people to really learn about issues that impact their communities, which is a lie. It's not going to happen. Issues that are going to inevitably come up in the midterm elections. Now, the major part is this, but also, getting them to register to vote first and foremost, right? So, I mean, I think all this camouflage and RICO and all this other shit you're talking about, the main thing is going to be registering people to vote and then pushing them to the vote for a certain group. Ironically, again, when you think about John C., he bankrolls Trump administration. So it's kind of like, the person who's funding and controlling you bankrolls Trump, and it's just, to me, it's just, man.
No, but don't worry, because they have an advisory board at the United Justice Coalition from Rock Nation that is going to take care of all of that. So you have Jonathan S. Abadi, the co-founding partner of Emery, Selly, Brinkeroff, and Abadi LLP, has a diverse trial and litigation practice with extensive experience in both federal and state courts in the area of civil rights. All right. So you got a civil rights attorney. You've got the assistant executive director of external affairs for the NFL Players Association in George Atala. Susan Taylor Batten is president and chief executive of ABFE, a philanthropic partnership for Black communities, established in 1971 as the Association of Black Foundation Executives. So she's involved. And Bradley Bridge, an assistant defender at the Defender Association in Philadelphia. So I'm sure I don't know much more about him either. But then, you got Charlemagne. I'm sure you got you got Ben Crump, as we said. You've got Dr. Dyson's wife, I believe, who is the founder of Public Relations and Women's Global Institute. I mean, so in other words, we've got this really good crew that's going to make sure, of course, Dr. Dyson himself, your man Van Jones, who is always on point and ready to be there for the people, So anyway, it's a good crew of folks here. Gail King, my son, there's Tamika Mallory, Carmen Perez, some names that we might recognize: Rashard Robinson from Color of Change.
Can you stop scrolling? I'm scared my face might pipe up. You need to
wait to see.
Everybody, slow down, man. I don't even know. Everybody there.
Ebony in the building.
Slow down.
K. Williams, Revolt and Black News. So that's Sean Diddy's outfit. Yeah. So anyway, it's a good crew. I mean, they're going to gather and they're going to solve all of the issues, all of the problems, and just in case if you were, so again, this is what I think is slick about all of this too. I mean, because when you look at their work, the work that their collective is involved in, you've got them in, working against murder, sex trafficking, and rape with Kansas City, Kansas group. You've got a George Floyd open letter. To Governor Tim Walz, and it included an excerpt from Dr. King's speech, the Parchman prison statement, support for John Adrian Velasquez. I mean, so, Block Power, which I think is a kind of a shady appropriation of Black power, but partnership with Register to Vote, which I do know pops up in opensecrets.org funding information, is, obviously connected to the Democratic Party. So for me, the issue, like one of the issues, at least, is that you have the presentation symbolically of them being engaged in issues that are obviously important, that are obviously emotional, when it comes to incarceration, sex trafficking, etc. But again, with the ultimate goal of just bringing us back, and this would be my point about the sheep herding, is bringing us back or keeping us in, so that when people start to concern themselves with these issues, they don't stray off that Democratic Party farm. And of course, with, there being no real solutions coming from that party as it's currently established. So anyway, that's some fascinating stuff there. And and then of course they are meant to gather in symbolic, nominal, and I guess literal negation and replacement of actual people doing, grassroots, radical, militant, political, organizational effort. So Jay-Z
get paid twice, and so since they represent Van Jones, that means they get a percentage of Van Jones cut too, huh?
Because he signed to the Rock Nation.
Oh, he signed to Rock Nation?
Yep.
Oh wow. As a what?
Personality, they say.
Yeah, public like they manage his bookings, book tours, and stuff like that. He's a Rock Nation performer.
Oh wow.
Rock Nation. It's the Rock.
So he'll be at the next Super Bowl too.
Probably.
Yeah. But you know, we're kind of, because we understand the hustle, you know, and I never said that the Democrats don't engage in, you know, manipulation of the black vote. You know, my only my only position was that Bernie's candidacy, I don't think, was some type of mass conspiracy to manipulate uh people to vote Democrat. And when Bernie ran for office, there wasn't even any threat of a mass black exodus or a mass voter exodus from the Democrats. So, you know, you don't really need to organize to stop something that wasn't in the process of happening in the first place. But we do have to acknowledge, in terms of the Democrats, I don't know, you know, I came up in a red state, you know, I travel through the red states all the time, and I live in a blue state. There are some, you know, measurable differences, you know. Here in Chicago, we just had bail reform. There are a lot of people at home with their families, able to go to work and sustain themselves while they're awaiting trial or under charges because of bail reform. We have a Democratic prosecutor here who is refusing to bring cases, minor cases, those minor harassment cases, traffic, minor drug offenses, nonviolent offenses, where the police are constantly stopping and harassing black people, taking them into custody, booking them into charges. And this black Democrat says, I'm not prosecuting all these cases. And she's literally at war with the Chicago Police Department, the Chicago police unions. We had a moratorium on executions here, put forward by a Democratic governor, when before the Republican governor was refusing. Even though I don't support minimum wage, I support a maximum wage. But in terms of even the minimum wage laws, I know a lot of people whose lives were directly affected by the mandatory $15 an hour minimum wage here in Illinois. So I think, as opposed to outright rejecting the Democrats, I think we do have to acknowledge what they do in the immediate impacts that they have on people's lives, and how various election cycles can bring hardship and calamity to black people, and black people in crisis mode are just trying to have some level of relief or harm reduction. I think when we start to acknowledge and engage that, I think we'll have a better argument to offer more radical solutions to the community, as opposed to saying, you know, I don't like these Democrats, and the Democrats ain't doing nothing for us. And we got grandmothers out here to say, my grandson is out of jail because of Democratic policies, or, you know, I'm getting some type of health care or welfare because of Democratic policies. So it's not as simple as they're both bad or they're both the same, and so we should just forget about them both.
No, I hear you, and I appreciate that. And just to clarify, my point is in some ways similar to yours, in that what I'm advocating in with I'll just keep, you know, coming back to my after party concept, is sort of the initial state of political organization engaged or developed before we engage whatever party, whatever politician, whatever race, whatever specific issue or electoral competition. So in other words, I'm not advocating in terms of the after party. I'm not saying we have to do. I'm not saying any one thing is right. Breaking with either party, developing an alternative party, supporting third or alternative parties, becoming one. All of those things I think are options. My initial point is that whatever we do has to have an original sort of political state of nature kind of that we have developed before we engage. So none of it is just blind, so but to the point also that we also don't get deluded because a few grandmothers or individuals are supported here and there by the Democratic Party into thinking that overall that they are to be expected to do that, or that they could be expected to do more, or that without that sort of arranged level of organization that we have to establish will be able to take place. So so in terms of the sheepdogging, I'm not saying that there was a mass conspiracy to put Bernie up there to stop something that had already begun within Black and other communities. What I am saying that it was sort of, I think it was seen as a serendipitous opportunity for the Democrats to preemptively keep people, Black and white, from leaving the Democratic Party in large numbers when they were recognizing that starting with the second term of Obama, they were seeing that the support for Obama and the Democratic Party was dwindling, that he was losing seats for the Democrats, more broadly speaking. Support for Hillary wasn't there. So they were saying, we're seeing all these people not supporting our preferred candidates as much as we want. Let's make sure that any of that tendency is not evolved into something that might actually threaten support for the Democratic Party by not, again, in a conspiratorial way, producing Bernie, but saying Bernie is there, he wants to run, let's take advantage of this, let's let him have some space. Obviously, they were not supporting him. Obviously, he was criticized. Obviously, he was encouraged by the party to drop out, but with enough energy already established, keeping people in the party. And again, I think keeping a lot of people around who might have considered some other alternative, or who might be at this point be willing to consider some other alternative. So I hope somewhere in there was some clarity about what I'm trying to say. But yeah, that's it. Go ahead.
It sounds like you explaining Jay-Z's role more than Bernie, because Jay-Z seemed like a tool to.
It's the same thing. I think it's the same thing. I think it's the same. It's again, they're not necessarily placing Jay-Z in some massive control puppet, whatever, but there he is. Let's take advantage of. He wants to intervene. He wants to increase his own I don't know, platform or relevance. Let's allow that in the way that will again bring people into the party. Go ahead.
I don't think that Jay-Z and Bernie Sanders have the same political ideology or the same political platform. Jay-Z, there was a famous photo of him sitting across from Forbes and that other investor guy, the Berkshire Hathaway guy,
Warren Buffett.
And yes, and that's where Jay-Z aligns. Yeah. That's who's influencing Jay-Z. He named his album, his record company, Rockefeller. Rockefeller, the first billionaire in the United States, was very big on philanthropy. You know, when I was young on welfare, living in the projects, I was able to do some things on Rockefeller grant, Rockefeller Foundation, K. Kellogg Foundation, Ford Foundation. You know, when I would get, little grants, or they'd give us some resources for the local Boys and Girls Club, it had on the paperwork, it would have those little logos of the Rockefeller Foundation, K. Kellogg, and DuPont. So that's where Jay-Z is, which is a world away from. In fact, these people hate Bernie Sanders. They hate Bernie Sanders. Bernie wants to tax these people, whereas Jay-Z is more on some let them eat cake type liberalism. Where Bernie's liberalism, he's more so a reformist. He does want to tax the elites. And I'm not saying any of this is a solution for Black people, but it is. Even if you look at the Democrats as opposition, in opposition research, you have to acknowledge within the Democratic Party, there is some divergent views and divergent interests and some divergent agendas.
But the apparatus itself, right? But the apparatus itself puts limits on that. So I'm not saying Jay-Z and Bernie are the same. I'm saying they are being differently used, or they have different approaches to the same use. But the apparatus that controls the Democratic Party does work to put limits on those differences within the party. So you might get a Nancy Pelosi, you might get a Rashida Tlaib, you might get Bernie Sanders as an independent flirting with the party here and there.
Right.
But so there are differences, but overall, those massive changes that most of us want, they're not going to be allowed to come through any of the candidates. But I am saying that Bernie was used to reach a certain audience in his way. Jay-Z is being used to reach a certain audience in his way, all of which is meant to keep us from going too far off that Democratic
But
Party.
when you say being used, that implies a user. Who is the user if he's being
the National Committee, the DNC, the major donors, the elite in the Democratic Party that have been in place going back specifically to the Clinton era to make sure that party doesn't go too far to the left.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
But
wait. So you wouldn't say Hillary or Bernie? Well, only thing Bernie did was really like, oh, I agree with Jay-Z about the war on drugs. But you would say Hillary wasn't using Beyonce and Jay-Z?
Who, me?
Yeah. When you say
no, I'm not saying that at all.
Oh, okay.
No, when he said Bernie and Jay-Z were being used, that's what
I said. They're
saying.
being differently used. They're being used similarly in their different. Their differences are being used similarly. I'm not saying they are the same.
There's a difference between being used and capitalizing on something. You know, like if someone goes, if there's something like Young Thug goes out and makes some statements about Black Lives Matter. He made some statements about poor people and reproduction. So then when he does that, or Kevin Samuels or somebody who's prominent does something in the public sphere, and then I use what they said as a springboard to inject deeper issues or a deeper, more radical analysis is what I do a lot, you know, where if I bring up Kevin Samuels and the concept of a high value man, and you know, I call that plantation, and I did a whole write up on the worth and worthiness of Black people and how we define our values and worth and worthiness based off Kevin Samuels' absurdist rhetoric. I use that, but I didn't use Kevin Samuels. I have no control. Kevin Samuels is not working for me. So taking advantage of a situation is what they all do. The DLC uses the horrendous policies and behaviors of the Republican Party. They use anything. So saying that they were opportunistic and tried to take advantage of a bad situation that they didn't want. They didn't want that situation, but of course they're going to maneuver. But when we put it in the context of, oh, Bernie was used, that leads us towards conspiracy and that he was cooperating, coordinating, and working on behalf of the DLC as opposed to working against the DLC. And I also, just one more thing, I kind of resent y'all making me, you know, the Democratic devil's advocate. I'm not a Democrat. I don't advocate for the Democrat. I'm just trying to, you know, just make the analysis more pointed. I just don't think that's accurate to say that he was being used. The DLC and the DNC took advantage of a situation, or tried to really they were regrouping and trying to recoup losses that were brought, and the loss of legitimacy that was brought by Bernie's candidacy.
So I think use and take advantage, there's like a fine line between it. So
I think Jay-Z is being used. I'm sorry to interrupt. Jay-Z is being used.
Yeah,
cooperating, coordinating, being directed, and checking in with them. And I think it's nothing but a win. They're not trying to have to fix or polish anything with him like they had to do with Bernie.
So I get the distinction you're drawing. Again, I'm just less interested in the distinction between being used officially, manipulated, or having a politics that works so well in coordination with what those in power would want. That distinction is real, but I think less important to me. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Geechee.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No. I think that's kind of what I was alluding to with like an example of, I know in sports, like for instance, if I'm a receiver and I'm blocking a person who's stronger than me, I know they're going to try to overpower me. So I'm going to use their strength against them. So I'm manipulating them that they come in at this certain kind of way, but I'm also like literally using their strength against them. So I feel like the word is, I would agree, is like kind of insignificant, but At the end of the day,
like there's a difference.
Which politics is getting run at the end of the day? Like who when you say capitalize, who's benefiting from it at the end of the day? Like rather you say use, or like, of course Bernie didn't have a contract like Jay-Z has a contract with these people. But yeah.
But let's say, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Let's say at this summit, Jay-Z gets on the stage and holds up a copy of The Myth of Black Buying Power, and then he just starts rambling on, doesn't even reference it. Then we're like, oh, Dr. Ball's being used. That's totally different. That's totally different than him getting up and holding up one of Van Jones's books and then starts to ramble on. And so when you say used, it implies a conspiracy. And I'm only saying this is because in the Black community, there's, number one, the rhetoric, oh, it ain't no difference between Democratic and Republican. Oh, Bernie's just another, conspiracy or trick played on us. And so all I'm seeking is, I think the nuance is important. I just think it's important in Black people's political analysis and understanding how to remedy these problems of being stuck in a two-party duopoly and the myriad of issues that emerge from being stuck in a two-party duopoly. And in order to defeat, or as voters ourselves, use the Democrats as for harm reduction, resource extraction, or disruption, or whatever we try to do with our positions within the political landscape.
Again, I get it, but the problem with your analogy is that my book doesn't support the politics of Jay-Z. So at best, he would be accused of attempting to co-opt my work for his purposes, whereas the work of Van Jones politically does support the work of Jay-Z. So whether he was officially directly manipulating Van Jones or simply being able to use the work of Van Jones for his own political goals, it's an important difference, and I agree with you on that. But my point of emphasis is on the political alignment as opposed to who was officially manipulating who. So whereas we can find some, like some evidence in the WikiLeaks drops about the Democratic Party attempting to promote Donald Trump, suppress Bernie Sanders after a certain point, et cetera, and so forth. I'm more interested in terms of my emphasis being on the political alignment of, in this case, a Jay-Z, Bernie Sanders, and a Democratic Party than in the differences between Jay-Z, Bernie Sanders, and the Democratic Party. But that's,
right.
But anyway, that's
exactly.
Go ahead.
That's my exact point. Bernie's policy platform did not align with the Democratic Leadership Council or the DNC, which is why
at a certain point.
Right.
At a certain point.
I mean, just the point where it's most relevant. I have a lot of problems with United States itself as opposed or governance and all that. But in terms of single payer health care, increasing the upper income tax rates to New Deal levels.
Right.
Right. Just those
but knowing
things.
that he was not going to get the nomination and also was going to support the nominee is my point. That's how Bernie was being used. Bernie was never going to take his people out of the party. He was never going to fight for the nomination till the end. And that was, I think, understood. And which is why, even though he may have differences with the party up to a certain point, he was not a threat in the way that people would have hoped, because as I predicted, and he did, I'm not leaving the party, and I'm telling you to support Biden. So
he leaving the party, he wasn't a Democrat. He only became a Democrat. He was an independent senator.
Right, but he never advocated his followers break from the Democratic Party.
Right,
and he
because
never advocated that they not support Biden. That's my point.
Right. And if you were his chief advisor, would you have told him to do otherwise within the political? All right. And then and then he would be out there with Jill Stein,
and better that. But see, that's my point. And I know we can't go on to, we got to guess it, but
right.
But that's my point. I would rather that this idea that you are effective in the game by staying within the limits of the prescribed game is, I think, mythology. You're more valuable to the struggle leaving and helping build the struggle. This whole thing of, I got to be on the inside is part of the myth. But anyway.
Well,
go ahead, get the last word, then we move on. Go ahead.
That doesn't really apply to a rich old white man. It ain't nowhere he can go to get outside. He can't travel far. He's never going to be grassroots in the streets with the people. That's over. He's a senator. He's a United States senator. But I'm saying, just from my mantra for U.S. politics is to be distant and calculating. And just from looking outside and just understanding the machinations that go on in internal politics, they were politicking. So I no longer support Bernie Sanders. I would also agree that Bernie Sanders should have just self-destructed before he allowed himself to be fully integrated into the machine. I agree with that tactic as well. I just don't agree with the analysis that his campaign was a sheepdog, or that he's just like being used like Jay-Z, or that he was used. I just don't think that is a critique that really informs us about the power dynamics and the struggles, and it doesn't really inform us on how we can engage the political structure to benefit our community.
All right, Diallo gets the last word. His defense of Bernie, his Bernie love his Bernie bro gets the last word. We'll be right back with our guests and talk about this educational system and is why maybe some of us have ended up in these places in the first place. Back in a quick second.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
All right, joining us back here at I Mix What I Like right here at Black Power Media is my main man, Dr. Brian Lozenski, who is, among many other things, the author of this new book, My Emancipation Don't Fit Your Equation, Critical Engagements in Black Education in the U.S. He is also Associate Professor of Urban and Multicultural Education in the Education Studies Department at McAllister College in St. Paul, Minnesota, and has, among many other things, we skip all the other nonsense, but he comes also out of the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University under the leadership of Dr. James Turner. So that's the main important point here. So what's up, Dr. Lozenski? Welcome to the show. Good to see you, my man.
What's up, fellas? Good to be here. I'm honored to be with y'all in the octagon.
It does feel like that a little bit, the intellectual octagon. But let me just ask the broad question before I get into any other specifics. What is it that you've attempted here with this book? What are gaps in the research are you trying to fill, and why do we all need to read it and continue reading?
Yeah, I think one of the main things I try to do a lot of different things in the book. It's not something where if you are and have been heavily engaged in the study of Black education US, that there's going to be all these like new references and understandings. What I try to do is to kind of paint a cohesive narrative that helps walk through, right? And so, just using the Lauryn Hill lyric, my emancipation don't fit your equation, right? The simplistic, understanding of that is it's like, Black folks talking to white folks, right? But within that, right, that's actually not the point, right? This is not a point to that. This is, I think, our ancestors speaking to us, right? And saying that we have strayed off the pathway that makes a direct and causal connection between education and liberation, right? And that we've strayed off the pathway and I think really entered into a problematic problematic set of educational circumstances that continues to demand our attachment to the nation state, continues to demand our attachment to basically to say, what's your role in a colonial project, as opposed to how do you work consistently and intentionally to be in the work of dismantlement. And not to say that tradition of I mean, when you say Black, there is no one tradition of Black education, right? I mean, that's part of what the book tries to do, is outline these tributaries, right? And the debates, and highlight all of the things that I think you all do such a good job on the show of trying to highlight, is that there's not, this monolithic thought around these things. But that being said, the question remains, to what extent is liberation, to what extent is liberation and has liberation been at the core of the different kinds of projects that Black folks have engaged in educationally? And what I argue is that that by and large, regardless if you had what some might consider a more radical project, or others might consider a more accommodationist kind of project, that there was a core of liberatory essence that has dissipated, really, I would argue, since the 1970s.
So before, let me, I don't know if Geechee and Diallo want to jump in just yet, but so I'll give them a chance to do so before I move on. Do either of you want to have something that you wanted to raise real quick?
No, I mean, before I even get in my question, I got a selfish question. So there's a couple reference to the maroon Gullah people, and then there's like the Geechee, and I'm like, did the GE, I mean a GICHE, I mean was that something like the spelling of that, the Geechee, like I don't know, is something I'm missing, or where did you get that from? Like Gullah, then Geechee, GICHI.
Oh man. That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I can't answer that, like where I got the spelling from. I mean, but I mean, I've seen that spelling before several times. If I'm off on it, then you can educate me on that. But
no, I mean, I've always seen it. Obviously, Gullah and then Geechee spelled the way my name is right here.
Your name spelled.
And then sometimes I do an IE at the end or whatever, but I've actually never seen it that way. So I didn't know if I was missing something. There was something, and then obviously, like referring to them as maroon, it was always kind of like this kind of debate around there. But I was just curious about that. But I mean, I have other questions, but I was specifically curious.
A debate around whether the Geechee Gullah community are maroons. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like, well, there's been kind of back and forth of like this separated, thriving group of people, as opposed to people who are relegated to a small area, and most of the life-sustaining resources is still not controlled by them. So it's kind of been like a, I mean, again, I don't know how you refer to maroons as, but sometimes we hear maroons as these people are self-sustaining, and they didn't interact per se with the white state at the time.
Yeah, and I think when you think about maroonage, it isn't like I would argue it's not a state of self-sustainability as much as it's a state of like really precarious fugitivity. And so it's people who are direct threat by their very existence, right, to the dominant power, right? And so in that regard, yeah, I would definitely consider the Gullah Geechee a maroon community. You can't exist in fugitivity and be in control of your own resources. I think that's I guess I'm not sure at what point in our history, in the Americas, we've had control, where I would say control of our resources in that sense. At best, the fugitive space, and I think the fugitive space, is always it's always like a temporal space, right? And it's always under threat. And so it's also, I think we get into some problems sometimes when we kind of like fetishize it a little bit and say like, this is where we want to like live our lives. And I'm like, that's actually not where we want. It's necessary in a freedom struggle, right? But it's not the destination.
Now, I mean, I actually appreciate that. That's how you termed it, fugitivity, because that fits to me. That's kind of like the phenomenon that fits me. And then I guess my question also around, so knowing that we're in that space, right? And then you have like, we're going into school, you have like state mandated curriculum, as you talked about. Like, how possible is it to actually navigate around like teaching our people like true history, or teaching people how to like you quoted James Baldwin, being displeased, being clear that the enemy is the state? Like how do you engage that contradiction? Or
yeah, I mean, and you know, I try to get to that in a lot of ways, right? Like, you know, the state is not going to teach you how to, you know, how to deconstruct the state, right? Like, so, you know, but that being said, you know, there are traditions of community schooling, right, that are quote unquote public, right? And so one of the things that I try to do is actually tackle the word public a bit, right? So, you know, we think about this idea of public, right? You know, it has lots of different meanings, lots of different uses. You know, you might be sitting in a restaurant and you're in public, but the restaurant's privately owned, right? And so there's this idea of like, are you able to be surveilled, right? I mean, you know, we could say this is a public conversation because, you know, anyone with internet access could log on and, right? But really one of the things that I'm going to get at is public as conflated with state run or state funded or state supported. And, you know, when you look at the history of some of the traditions of how Black folks have engaged in educational struggles, it has been in what I would describe as counter public spaces, right? So recognizing that public space is a supremacist space, right? And so publicness in and of itself is not, doesn't suffice, right? And so how do people engage in you know, feminist theorist Nancy Fraser says counter publics are spaces of regroupment, right? Spaces where you can come into relative non-surveillance, you know, relative safety, and then prepare to re-engage with supremacist publics, right? So that it's a space for us to prepare. And so I would argue that tradition of Black education, the counter public tradition, is where and counter public not meaning like anti-public, but counter public meaning anti-supremacist public, right? And so counter publics are public spaces, right? They are spaces where you know, folks who are feeling you know, attacked by broader publics can come together for the purpose of. And so, you know, I try to outline different kinds of counter publics. You know, freedom schools, I think, were certain kinds of counter publics. You know, certainly the CB schools, the independent Black schools were forms of counter publics, even though there were, you know, a lot of times where they were kind of like just groupings of families, you know, that were basically tired of the traditional public school system. So, you know, I mean, I think there are lots of ways to think about that, but I want us to be more strategic and think about how do we actually build these kind of counter publics, you know, for a larger group of our kids.
So you get into you touch on one of my favorite debates, and I definitely wanted you to hear your expanded thoughts on it. So are HBCUs counter publics or not? Because you touch on you touch on the what I simplifies the William Watkins versus Jelani Favors argument, where Watkins is like, and where I'm biased, HBCUs created by white colonists for colonial purposes, and Favors likes to emphasize the hidden curriculum and the undercurrents of liberationist teaching. But maybe if you would say a little bit about how you work with that.
I mean, I you know, and I'm not you know, I can't talk from the position of a HBCU alum or professor, so you know, I'll take this with a grain of salt. I mean, I do think.
Oh, whoops, sorry about that. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, so I was just saying, I do think it's a both and. You know, certainly, you know, Bill Watkins is correct, right? In the analysis, and sorry, my dog's trying to get outside.
Good.
In his analysis that of the origins of our HBCUs and their political purposes, as developed by both private philanthropists and the state, right? And Jelani's also right. I mean, anytime you get people together who are facing, similar forms of marginalization, they're gonna, like oppression begets liberation struggle, right? And so, yeah, I mean, you definitely can look at, I mean, I use the example of like, the Greensboro Four, right? Like they're at, they're in their dorm room, plotting to do the lunch counter strikes, right? So like it's a both and, right? And so we have to be able, and I say very, very early on in the book, like this requires being able to walk and chew gum at the same time, right? And I end with this Denise Ferrer da Silva's notion of like the black light as a methodology or as an analytic, right? That when we look at something, we have to be able to also look at it in the black light, which is a form of recoding, right? And so we might look at something in its like, in its kind of like regular form as Bill Watkins does, right? And see that, yeah, like that these institutions were created to continue to perpetuate the kind of racial hierarchy that had already been in existence, right? And to possibly be able to like, I mean, there's always this notion, right? The past absolves the present, right? Be like, well, y'all, y'all got education now, right? So, so we can't be critiqued on that, right? And then, but then when you turn the black light on and you do see people struggling, right? You do see people forming radical coalitions. You do see people engaged in political education that is anti-state, that is anti-supremacist publics and all of those kind of things. So I mean, I do think it's a both and we can argue to what extent, right? I think maybe that's the argument that we could engage in.
Real quick. I wonder how much radicalization is. For instance, at Howard, you have the university. Across the street, you have Sankofa, and you got some community activity. How many of those people are radical, and how influential is everyone's place and places like that to Morgan, as opposed to how many people are like black capitalists signing with the state or whatever? And so who gets the credit for the radicalization of HBCU students? Is it the community and the bookstores and the organizers?
I gotta throw it a little salt. The relationship between Sankofa and Howard can't be compared to the relationship between Everyone's Place and Morgan, because the relationship between Everyone's Place and Sankofa, I think, are not the same. I don't think they're the same. I don't think the politics of their leadership are the same. But I'll say the relationship of Everyone's Place, which is still my favorite black bookstore ever, to Morgan is non-existent. It has no positive impact on Morgan whatsoever. Would be my humble estimation. I'll leave the Sankofa Howard one to another time. But to what I feel like they're probably more in line with each other than people might want to admit. But anyway,
Jared, to what extent are the students going to that bookstore? You know what I mean?
To my knowledge, they don't even know it exists. Would be my because for the years I've been there, whenever I bring up Everyone's Place, which is quite often, I'm often introducing it to them. It's rare that students have come to me saying, I was at this bookstore, Dr. Ball, blah, 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 blah. It's also different geographically that, Sankofa is right across the street from Howard. You could walk over there and get, Everyone's Place doesn't have a cafe, or I don't think Sankofa does anymore either, but there was never, anyway, there's some important differences in the comparisons if we would really get it right. But just in terms of the awareness, I think you're more likely to have someone at Howard aware of Sankofa, both because of the geographic proximity and the political proximity, I would argue, and as opposed to finding students at Morgan running into Everyone's Place Although I know Brother Nati at least used to have a show on WEAA. I don't know if that show still goes on, but WEAA itself doesn't have a real relationship, despite broadcasting from Morgan State with Morgan State students. So anyway, I know I said a lot there, but you know, I don't know. Go ahead. Somebody.
I know Diallo has something. My bad.
Well,
Okay.
I was very interested in where you could touch on pursuing or viewing education as a means to get a job or elevate oneself, and how that potentially distracts from the liberation elements of education.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a direct, you say distraction, right? I mean, you know, there is an industry of, you know, what's called college and career readiness, right? That you know, kind of permeates K-12 education, way that in a way that, you know, positions students to be having, that's the primary question, right? The primary question, and you know, again, like teaching at a college, it still comes in as the primary question of like, how will this allow me to get a job, as opposed to what is my relationship to a liberation struggle, right? Or as opposed to what's my role in this kind of social transformation. And so yeah, we're constantly having to do kind of this remediation work, right? To be able to say, yeah, the thing you went through, you know, and I mean, and this is, you know, it's classic Carter G. Woodson, right? I mean, it's right. There's two kinds of education: the kind you're given, the kind you give yourself, right? And the latter is far more important. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the material realities of education. I mean, yes, like there should be vocational education, right? There should be spaces where we do learn how to feed ourselves, how to, like, you know, do the things that we need to do to just survive as human beings, right? And those things can happen in schools, they can happen outside of schools, right? But you know, I think when you look at the history of you know, post you know, I mean, I use the Saidiya Hartman phrase, right? You know, post enslavement, but non-emancipation. I'm forgetting the language now. But this question was literally, the question was, how do we get free, right? Like, what does freedom mean? And that was at the cornerstone of the educational endeavor, not necessarily how do we get a good job, right? And then some people would argue, right? And that was the, you know, that was the Du Bois Booker T debate, right? Which I, you know, everyone, I mean, and I'm not the first person. A lot of people said it's a false debate, right? It's a false dichotomy of liberal, you know, classical education and industrial education. That, you know, if you actually look at what each of them were saying, not just them, but like actually, honestly, the people who are more practitioners. So I point to people like Fannie Jackson Coppin, who was engaged in and had studied, you know, liberal arts education at Oberlin, I believe, and then but was engaging Black women in this form of industrial education. But she was also studying Marx, right? She was also studying political economy, right? And her argument was part of an industrial education is the study of political economy, right? And so we see, again, it's like a both and, right? So you know, I feel like trying to, you know, I want to avoid the false dichotomy there as well. But
and I haven't. Du Bois and Booker
today
T also wrote a
is
book
not the
together.
question.
By the way, they also, you know, Booker T and Du Bois wrote a book on education together. They, you know, so that I don't remember the details of it, but the you know, that dichotomy is a little bit more nuanced than I think it's given credit.
Yeah, and all Du Bois was really saying too was like, let's recognize the intellectual, the theoretical aspects of work, right? Like he wrote in the you know, the Black Artisan, right? Like that, you know, we have to understand that engaging, putting your hands in the dirt is also like intellectual work. That's really all Du Bois was saying.
Right. And by the way, were you talking about the CD of Hartman, where you quote her as saying the abolition of slavery and the non-event of emancipation? Yeah.
My bad.
Okay.
That's why I was blanking already.
Well, yeah. Well, I just went and found it in your book, so I mean, it's all good.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I think lately, I since we mentioned Du Bois, lately I've been like reading some Harry Haywood, critique of Garvey and W.E. Du Bois, and then engaging people. And there's just like this, visceral disdain for Du Bois. He's a sellout and all these other things. And I'm curious to see how you respond to that. And then also just even maybe some of your critiques of Garvey per se. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think to call Du Bois a sellout is, I just think that's like historically, I just think that's like historically ignorant. I mean, first of all, Du Bois in his 90 plus years of life, right, moved politically in various directions. So it's like, what Du Bois are you actually, are you talking about, right? And how do you even capture somebody, I mean, who was the most prolific academic of not even talking about Black folks. I mean, the most prolific academic of the 20th century, and was engaged in political struggle, right? And trying to proliferate Pan-Africanism globally, right? Like, I mean, so I don't know, I mean, I'm definitely consider myself, an honor to be called a Du Boisian scholar, right? Like, and so, I think it's important to be able to situate that. Yeah, he shifted politically. So, I mean, I don't agree with him telling Black folks to fight in the war, in World War I. But right after that, then he starts the Pan-African Congresses, right? So like, I mean, again, like, what Du Bois are we talking about, and when, and how do we look at him holistically in his entire body of work? Some people to say like he wasn't connected, with everyday Black folks. He wasn't connected on the ground. There might be something to that. In his first study, though, the Philadelphia Negro, I mean, he was basically unearthing the lives of everyday folks. You know what I mean? His first teaching position before after coming out of Fisk, right? I mean, he just, he lived with the community, right? Like, I mean, there could be critiques, waged. I think, and then Garvey, I mean, I really love, there's a quote that I put in there from C.L.R. James, where he basically says, Du Bois raised the Black question. And by the Black question, he means the Black liberation question. So he's like, Du Bois lifted up the Black question, and then Garvey made it a popular question, right? And I think one of the things with Garvey is that and I get at this too, right? That I think one of the problems that we face is that we take this idea of Black basically for granted, right? Like we like that everybody knows exactly what it is that we're talking about, and that there's some kind of container for this notion of Blackness. And what I try to do, and Stuart Hall writes about this, basically that Blackness can't just be this like floating signifier, right? We have to actually continue to interrogate what it signifies, right? And so, when you start to look at that would be one of the critiques that I might have of Garveyites, is that, I think when you look at some of Garvey's writings, like he was definitely attached to racialism, meaning like like, I mean, even to go as far as like a biological understanding of race, right? and that there's this like racial essence about people that I think Du Bois was less connected to. Du Bois was, I think, more concerned about the material conditions that creates that creates the need for this thing called race, right? As opposed to taking it face value. And so I think for me, that's where you get into most of the nuance between the two of them. But you know, I mean, how am I going to critique Garvey, right? You know, who produced a Malcolm, who produced, right? Like, how am I going to critique these things? You know, and also we have to pay attention to the influences of like Booker T on Garvey, right? I mean, so you know, like there's a lot of,
yeah, I think it's funny. Even in the chat, I see, you know, there's that circular logic that we see when this conversation comes up, that people have their preferences, but it is, I think, interesting that Garvey followed Booker T, who was often considered to be a sellout or soft politically. Both had opposition and overlap with Du Bois, and all of them, including Cyril Briggs, engaged in various forms of the racialism you talk about, going at each other. And then all of them go at each other in terms of snitching on each other to the feds. So like, you know, it's, if you know, so there's all kinds, like Garvey was snitching on Cyril Briggs, just like every, you know, and just like, and I mean, every, you know, so they all, like everybody.
And all of them were eventually attacked by the state. Right, like let's keep our eye on the ball, right? Like,
well, Nas said the best supposed to clash at the top. So
okay, there it is.
It's just
steel
battling.
sharpened steel. Yeah, that's it. That's what they say. Anthony D likes to remind us, you know, as has been coming up a lot lately, even on this platform, that Garvey was not a Pan-Africanist. He was a Black nationalist. And there are differences, and I get the differences. I think but in terms, the differences between Garvey's approach and the Pan-Africanism of Du Bois is important to understand. But in terms of the broader concept of all African people are African people, then I think then Garvey does, I think, fall into that that part of the categorization. So anyway, but
yeah, I mean,
but
you know, interesting. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, go on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think these are the conversations that need to be had. I mean, you talk about blackness necessarily must be transnational, right? Like, and so it's, I think even the idea of like Black nationalism demands us to be understanding of like, to understand how nation states work, and the ability for these things to be formed and maintained. But you know, blackness doesn't stop at the border, right? So I mean, I'd say in that regard, you know, Garvey certainly was engaging in Black transnationalism, whether you want to call it Pan-Africanism or not. You know, he certainly wasn't part of like the, you know, the Congresses and all of those kind of, you know, those movements, right? And you know, Shepperson talks about capital P Pan-Africanism and lowercase p Pan-Africanism, right? So I mean, I think, you know, I think there we got to get to a level of nuance in these.
Speaking of which, go ahead, Diallo. Go ahead.
Well, I also would like you to speak on, you know, the complexities of Christianity, you know, and how dare you tie Christianity to slavery. And so if you could expound on that a bit, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah. You know, and I definitely, you know, kind of I start out, or not even start out. At some point I get into how Christianity was, you know, again, I keep coming back to this both and, these dualities, right? And I think this is why the black light piece is so important, right? So we look at Christianity, we look at its impact and its core and centrality within the transatlantic slave trade, and we look at its use as a source of control, right, as a source of social manipulation, to our enslaved ancestors, right. And then we turn on the black light and we find that, like, biblical literacy was a rationale to engage in a form of Black education, right? Whether it was Black folks wanting to, read the Bible themselves, or whether it was, the mistresses, the white mistresses of the slave house wanting, to redeem the souls of their non-human, right? Their non-human commodities, right? By teaching them to read the Bible, right? Literacy is literacy. And, you can't, once it's like Pandora's box. Once you open it up, you can't necessarily contain it, even though we try, right? with regard to, our most of our educational institutions, right, to be able to put that box in there. But and so you look at, you look at some of the slave revolts, right? You look at even Frederick Douglass talking about the mistress of the house teaching him to read, and I think it was Mr. Auld, right, said, learning to read will spoil the best nigger. And he was, and basically Frederick Douglass was like, yeah, it will, right? Like, and so I mean, the complexity of Christianity is that there was this literacy component to the religion that opened up a space for some sense of examination, of social examination, that was different than the social examination of just being in the world, right? So, like, yeah, there was obviously, like, people just able to read, right, just reading the world and reading conditions, right? And then there's also people being able to read the word, and then being able to use that word for liberatory purposes.
Well, you've kind of dealt with the both in the discussion with the HBCUs and now with the complexities of Christianity. But I tend to look at things from both of those issues and many others related to Black people, that Black people were able to do good things in spite of, not because of.
Sure.
And then when you look at the sum total, I just had a discussion about this Robin Hood myth, where a person who does bad things for ultimately good purposes, this bad institutions, or these Negro institutions, or these slave institutions, but ultimately we're able to extract good. So we give credence to those institutions when we did what we did in spite of those institutions, not because of them.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, and I think that's I definitely agree with that point. I'm not saying that it was necessarily because of Christianity, but I was saying that Christianity, in the practices, right, in the rationalizations that went along with it, opened up space for different kinds of practices, right? So that, like, it was like a hidden, right? You could use the cover of Christianity, right, to do certain things that wouldn't otherwise have been done. So I agree with you. I'm not saying it's like, let's celebrate the church and that's da. No, I think it was a primary factor in, you look even just at the origins of slave trade before like the racialization of enslavement. It was a religious proposition, right? The law of the land was that Christians could not be enslaved, right? And that enslavement was reserved for non-Christians, right? But then it's too easy to convert, so then then it becomes like a Black thing. But yeah, so there's I agree with that point you're making.
Yeah, if I can, there's before we get out of here, unfortunately, there's a couple of questions there's a couple things in the chat that I wanted to get to, but for you, Brian, I wanted to ask at least one of the bigger, broader questions, because I haven't read it fully or closely enough yet, but at the end of your book, you talk about well, throughout the book, actually, you mentioned once or twice, you discuss a little bit about this issue of ethnic studies, and I wanted to ask you about that in terms of, I believe you're talking about in terms of where are we headed, where are things headed, and so like you have in the last section of the book, new battlefronts, living in the break, going for broke. I'm assuming there's a hip hop analogy in terms of living in the break. But when you talking about the fight for ethnic studies, educational self-determination, the fight for ethnic studies, what are you saying there? What is it that you're talking about there? Because as I remember it, the argument was always that ethnic studies was being brought in to weaken the project of Africana studies and to take away the autonomy of Black-led or African-centered education, or again, the Africana Studies project. So what are you saying here? What do you see happening?
Yeah, I guess I never really read the history that way. I mean, you look at, my argument is like that ethnic studies before it was named as such was already happening, right? So we know that there was forms of Black studies, of Africana studies that were emerging since the project of school started, right? And the same thing. So ethnic studies to me is a solidarity movement. It's to say, okay, if we look at, Latinx communities, we look at Asian communities, we look at indigenous communities, they're doing the same thing, right? Their marginalization demands a reckoning about their own educational subjectivity, right? And so then when you look at San Francisco State in between 1965 and 1967, before everything kind of popped off and with the strike and everything in 1968, I mean it was a solidarity struggle. It's the Third World Liberation Front, right? That was an anti-colonial move to connect Black studies, Asian American studies, Latin American study, Latinx, Chicanic studies, and indigenous studies together in this interdisciplines of what we call ethnic studies, right? And that was the source of the movement. When you look at the original demands of the Third World Liberation Front, you can see, I think, this very radical and very much a movement for solidarity. Now, the other argument, and I think, man, I don't know, my brain's not working this morning. The reorder of things. Roderick Ferguson argues, right, that post that explosion in 1968, which also we know, I mean, I write about, Cornell in 69 and Willard Straight Hall takeover and those, right? This was a national movement, right? That it didn't. So I don't think it was an attack on Black studies. I think it actually like proliferated the ability for those programs to exist. But post that, I think you get the argument of the co-optation, right? So that's what I think Roderick Ferguson's trying to get at in the reorder of things, saying these institutions then, once people kicked in the door, said, all right, well, y'all are in right now, so have a seat at the table and we'll just keep you at the kids' table. We're going to marginalize you. We're going to keep your programs underfunded. We're going to, but you'll exist, and you'll exist, right, in the service of the institution. So, and that's been at the core of that tension, right? So I think the ethnic studies disciplines still are the conscience of the institution to be able to continue to say, y'all ain't doing right? Like, you're problematic in terms of the kinds of knowledge you're producing, the way you're engaging with communities, the way you're extracting and the kind of relationships you have with surrounding communities. But that's always at tension. And so I'm not sure, where I guess I haven't really heard that the ethnic studies.
Well, I remember I'm going back to for instance, intellectual warfare from Jacob Carruthers is where I think I first got put on to that logic. But like even in the history of Dr. John Henrik Clarke talking about Hunter College and the disunity that ended up emerging between the Black and Brown studies programs and all of that. But and then some of what I think was attempting to happen even while I was at the Africana Center was that there was this argument that all should be sort of put under the ethnic studies umbrella, given a common dean, that kind of, and then it was felt that you would get the lack of autonomy for Black studies. You would get the imposition not only of other so-called people of color, which is, I think, less an issue, but particularly there was concern over women's studies which was seen as white women's studies, being put in the ethnic studies group, which was, like another way of ideologically siphoning out the radicalism. So that's where, honestly, I have not read your section 5 of this book, so I didn't get to see how you were making the argument. So that's why I just thought to ask you about that.
And I think that's definitely an important analysis to show how the institutions then engage in, starve these programs for resources, pit them against each other, and then try to ghettoize them by like consolidating, right? So, but I think part of the argument though is like our questions we need to also be addressing is like, what's our relationship? What's Black folks' relationship to indigenous folks, right? What's Black folks' relationship to Asian Americans, and that we can't actually have a full analysis of Black studies absent the analysis of these. It's not just about how are we positioned with against white supremacy. And so, I mean, but
no, that's cool.
The origins of this for me are about solidarity.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask this question, because you do talk about abolition. So let me bring up Sith Lord Prince's question. What are Dr. Bryan's thoughts on abolitionist teaching? In what ways can or does abolitionist teaching fall into elite capture or neoliberal projects?
Yeah. And I mean, I think the reemergence of the idea of abolition is really interesting, right? I do kind of frame the book through these like 3 lenses: fugitivity, abolition, and accommodation, and saying that we have to understand both the overlaps and the distinctions among these ideas, right? And that abolition is the direct confrontation, the above ground confrontation with systems of power. And that also, and I spend some time looking at Black education within the antebellum abolitionist struggle, right? And so understanding that in that case, abolition was not necessarily, it wasn't antithetical to white supremacy. It wasn't antithetical to white saviorism, right? It wasn't antithetical. It wasn't synonymous with liberation, right? So that's back to the Saidiya Hartman, abolition of slavery, non-event of emancipation, right? That abolition on those terms was okay with that, right? And so what I'm looking for in the reemergence of abolition, which mostly has been tied to incarceration, right? And so the abolition of the carceral state and the role of education within that, right? I think is the discourse that's happening today. My question is, how do we make sure that the abolition that we're talking about today does not make the mistakes of the abolitionist movement that ended legal enslavement, but continued to perpetuate social hierarchy, right? And particularly racial hierarchy. And so that's what I'm looking for in the movement of today, to make sure that I do think, looking at how people have been using the term abolition has been interesting. I think it's been very varied today. So you have some people who are like, abolition means the destruction of the carceral state. It means the destruction of all of the things that create the need for carcerality, that create the need to create like blackness as an illegal condition, all right. And it connects that to disability, connects it to gender, connects it like all these, kind of like really powerful intersectional arguments. And I'm also seeing a very liberal tradition of abolitionist education that is about equality of discipline, right? Like, let's just make sure that there's no, that there's no racial gaps in terms of our discipline, right? Let's just make sure that there's no, right? But it doesn't actually get to the structures of the need for discipline, and it doesn't examine how the carceral state needs basically like a carceral schooling structure. And so I think, so it's a very wide conversation right now. And I wanted to make sure to push with the folks, the Miriam Kabas and folks like that who are really, I think, getting at the core of the carceral state.
Right on. Geechee Diallo, you want to get back in anything? Otherwise, yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I guess the pushback that Jarrett gets, and I guess Diallo and everyone, when you are critiquing systems or explaining nuance or problems. And so in the book you was talking about like You Wishes was a victory book. And then, you talk about education and survival, and then how do you respond to or even engage people who, respond with, okay, so what's the solutions? Like, can we get to the solutions? Like, what's your response to that?
Yeah. And I say, I say, I wish I was telling the tale of victory, but if wishes were fishes, we'd all catch nets. And so when it comes down to, I think part of it is the historical story gives us it tells us the breadcrumbs, right? I mean, folks left trails of like, what do you do? So when we say like, what do we do? I think we look and say, well, what were people doing? Right. And people were doing things despite the state. So for instance, there's a whole chapter on, educational infrastructure, Black educational infrastructures. Right. And so, I look to historians like Vanessa Siddle Walker, who's talking about the Black teachers unions that were formed all across the South to do a network exchange of labor, analyses of labor conditions, of curricular knowledge sharing, of teaching practices. All of these things were happening, of political agitation, right? All of these things were basically destroyed with Brown v. Board. So, that recreating that kind of infrastructure would certainly be necessary. We looked at, for instance, another analysis was around the Rosenwald schools, right? So the white Sears Roebuck philanthropist Julius Rosenwald, right, working with Booker T and other folks out of Tuskegee, right, to basically, and James Anderson calls this double taxation, right? Like, so Black folks were paying, taxes toward the public schools and only getting, a tenth of what white folks were getting toward, their own public education. And so they, also worked to do this with this philanthropic model, right? To be able to like re-up and create, to the fact that 1/3 of Black children in the South were attending Rosenwald schools, right? And the idea there is like, it's not about like, oh, we need to go and like do this private philanthropy work, right? The idea was, how did these folks support, right, in spite of the state, right, in spite of the dispossession of their own education, how did communities work to build, schools that they could be able to send their kids to, that they had some semblance of control over in terms of curriculum, in terms of, right? So, and I'm not, and so I'm not arguing that it's about like, following, a neoliberal philanthropy model. But what I am arguing is saying, like, how do we reconceptualize public, right? Because we know that the conflation of state run is not about our own liberation.
Wow. So unfortunately, I do have to wrap at 10 this morning. The work world does, they keep, putting these demands as like, I can't fully break away. But there was a lot more that we definitely have to get to. And I want to absolutely invite you back to talk more about this book. I have to finish reading it, and there's so much more to get into. Yeah, anyway, so let me just give you any last thoughts, any last words from any of you. And again, remind everybody that we're talking about My Emancipation Doesn't Fit Your Equation, Critical Engagements of Black Education in the U.S. by Dr. Brian Lozenski. Is the book. It's out there. Please get it if you at all can, and support the work. But yeah, any last words, Brian, Geechee, Diallo?
So coming from the I'm sorry, Dr. Clark, Amos Wilson, these people, I always had this concept of the purpose of education is to solve problems, education is a cultural defense mechanism. I guess in your last words, do you agree with it, or how would you tweak that?
Yeah, I mean, we gotta remember the distinction, like Carter G. Woodson made between schooling and education, and that Mwalimu Shuja reminded us, right? Too much schooling, too little education, and so schooling as a mechanism of state domination and state control, education as a self-determined collective engagement in problem solving and social transformation. Yeah, so that I think that nails it for me. I do want to also shout out.
You said midnight schools, right? That's what they were called. What was the sister that called? Did you refer to the midnight schools? Do I remember?
Yeah,
that part, right?
Mila Granderson. And I kind of position these polls with Prince Hall on one side of things, right? Creating a school in his crib, and Mila Granderson doing the midnight schools. One was a free Black man in Boston. One was an enslaved Black woman in Kentucky, right? And between there, lots of things exist.
I'm glad you didn't put the Gullah Geechee Penn School, because that was a rough history. That was independent there.
Okay. I do want to shout out my brother Kamal Kokai Taylor, who made the cover of the book. I gave him an idea and he ran with it, and I really like how it came out. You can find him at Jelani Tunes on Instagram, and support that brother. He's got all kind of cool stuff. Got that Boondocks kind of feel to it, so
it's hot. It's definitely hot for sure. Well, listen, fellas, thanks to all of you. I really appreciate you coming through this morning. Definitely thanks to the remixers and all those who will hear and see this later on all their favorite platforms. Definitely like, share, subscribe, do all that good stuff. Get that good merch at blackpowermedia.org as well. And Dr. Lozenski, man, it's a pleasure having you on, man. Look forward to doing it some more. Appreciate you. And to my comrades in Geechee and Brother Diallo, thanks a lot. And we'll catch you next time here at I Mix What I Like and all throughout Black Power Media. Keep it locked. A whole bunch of stuff coming. And as Fred used to say, we say peace to you if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody. Catch you next time.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. What I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.